I am Quentin Hardy, and it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. Now, there is a cheerful word for breaking stuff in the Silicon Valley, and that word is disruption. And it usually signifies capturing a market with radical new methods that old incumbents can't match. Oh, Microsoft will disrupt older mainframe computers or offices, pens and paper, have us word processing everything. Or now Uber is disrupting taxis, or Google disrupts advertising, much to the regret of certain industries represented here tonight. Our guest, Taylor Owen, believes that online technologies are disrupting government itself and upending the market, if you will, for political power. It's not clear who is the Uber in this yet, or for that matter, whether it plays out the way businesses tend to play these things out. Whether the old guys get wiped out, whether they co-opt, or whether they do something radically new. Taylor Owen is an assistant professor of digital media and global affairs at the Graduate School of Journalism and the Liu Institute for Global Issues at the University of British Columbia. He is also a senior fellow at the Columbia Journalism School, where he previously served as the research director for the Tao Center for Digital Journalism. He is the founding editor-in-chief of the Canadian International Council's International Affairs program OpenCanada.org, the director of the International Relations and Digital Technology Project, and the research director of Munk Debates. I thought you said you had a 2-year-old. How can you hold these jobs? His current work focuses on the intersection of digital technology and international relations. In his book, Disruptive Power, some of the values and forces shifting the state are explored. He also offers prescriptions for what the state and we the people ought to do to help along a healthy outcome. Please join me in welcoming Taylor Owen for a conversation about how new technologies disrupt the power of traditional institutions and give new actors the ability to shape international affairs.
Thanks.
So, Taylor,
Yeah.
what made you want to write this book in the first place?
Well, so my background is in international relations, and somewhat surprisingly, international relations as a discipline hasn't been particularly good at engaging with technology, and particularly digital technologies. And the origins of sort of myself engaging in the topic was I was doing research in Cambodia for my PhD, and I was trying to look at ways in which people were becoming more the things that were threatening individuals, so the harms people were facing. And I was in the basement of an NGO that was looking at demining, and a guy in the basement gave me a data set of all the U.S. drop points in Cambodia, and said, "This hasn't been published before. You should do something with this." And so I sent it to a Cambodian historian.
By
and
drop points, you mean
all sorties over Cambodia during the
every
entire
bombing run?
215,000 of them.
Wow.
Including data. And so I opened
I
up
assume that's just a map of Cambodia.
it essentially, so I took the CD home, like, yeah, right, this is not what you're telling me it is, right? And I put it in my computer, and I loaded it, and the map of Cambodia becomes red, right? It just covers in dots. And then you look at what the database showed, and it showed the type of plane, the target they were going for, the date, the tonnage, everything about it, right? And it turns out this data was actually collected for all of Indochina, in Laos and Vietnam as well. And it was built by, so as I started looking into this, it was built by IBM as one of the first large database projects ever, a collaboration between the US Air Force and IBM. And so that and I ended up spending a lot of time looking at this data, analyzing this data, figuring out both the origins of it, what it tells us about historical narratives, how it was used, how it was politicized, right? And really diving into this. And that got me on this track of looking at the connection between data and international affairs. But the one thing I think you really see now with new technologies is that we knew that that the security concept that we've attached to states wasn't necessarily preserving the security of individuals, right? We knew that individuals were threatened by a whole host of other things that they weren't being protected from states. But what new technologies allow, I think, is for individuals both to protect and to harm themselves outside of that state construct. And to me, there's something really interesting there. And when you look at this international affairs space, and you look in the humanitarian space, the diplomatic space, the study of conflict and violence, the study of media in international affairs, you see really deep siloed conversations about the way technology is changing those particular spaces, but you don't see a lot of things that connect those actors in those different spheres together, and looks at what empowers them, what capabilities do they have using technology, and what ways are states and established actors pushing back. And that's what I really wanted to try and do.
No, you talk about IBM, which is a fairly durable corporate institution, working with the U.S. government, which is a fairly durable institution as well.
Yeah.
Now you've got a situation where people are highly dispersed, they're networked, they have access to computing power IBM couldn't have dreamt of, they can video things, they can find things. How is that changing the threat and the opportunity to the state?
Right, so part of what I wanted to do with this was just map out how actors in the international affairs space were using this technology, right? You heard a lot of rhetoric about the Arab Spring and the organizational capacity of these technologies, but really what are people doing and how are they using these technologies? And when you do that, I think you find that there's a lot of common characteristics of how they're structured and how they leverage these technologies.
What'd you find?
So there's a formlessness to these organizations, right? There aren't leaders, they're highly decentralized, they're constantly evolving. They are very chaotic in the sense that they're rapidly evolving. They don't build an infrastructure and then maintain it and grow it over time. They're constantly shifting. They're highly collaborative. There's ability to enable collective action without this sort of hierarchical control.
In some
and I
ways,
think a lot of these things end up being the types of things that the modern state and the modern hierarchical institution was meant to dissuade, right? We tried to control these attributes, and now they're flourishing in this digital space. And I think that in a real fundamental way threatens some of these institutions.
there are corporate parallels that are actually worth raising because I think they're kind of illuminating. You know, in the 90s, big software companies were terribly disrupted by open source software, which is people in all sorts of geographies, not often working in common offices, you know, a proxy for countries, if you will, working in sort of self-organizing ways around the central thesis of what the software is. And there is leadership inside these. They're not utterly chaotic. And I would argue, even inside an anonymous, there's a kind of leadership where they choose what their target's going to be for that act. You know, and certainly in an Al-Qaeda or an ISIS, you know, these new non-state actors, there is some kind of leadership.
Absolutely.
And the corporations didn't know how to deal with these guys. At first they laughed it off because they don't work like us, and then they couldn't figure out how it organized, and then it just got upended. And are we seeing the same kind of thing play out in a state level?
So I think we are we're not seeing the state necessarily being upended because states, unlike corporations, can't creatively destruct. They don't go away. And they have fundamentally different mandates. In a capitalist model, we're okay with corporations coming and going. We're okay with that sort of fluidity. And we accept the fact that when a corporation goes out of business, people will lose jobs and they'll find jobs in other places or not. And as a society, we're okay. That's a contract we've entered into with our capitalist model. That's not the case with governments, though. Governments have a different mandate. They have to provide collective social goods. They can't go away. And so they have to adapt, and they have to adapt in a world where the innovation is largely happening in institutions outside of their control. If you're a newspaper and you're not adapting fast enough, then you will be replaced by other medias and other companies. That can't happen in the governance space, and so it leads to a real challenge in how we evolve our form of government.
Now, I'm old enough to have visited the old East Berlin, and you'd go to these, for want of a better term, totalitarian states, or even the ones in the West, and there are these buildings you always saw. Ministry of Post and Telecommunications, Central Bank, Army/secret police, and they were all proxies for controlling the border in a way. this is how you can get messages out. This stamp works up to here, then you need a
Yep.
different stamp, and we'll regulate whether you can use it.
Yeah.
Or this is the money that works as far as here. After this, you have to have somebody else's money.
Yeah.
These are the army can control this, and the police can push people around up to this limit. You know, and one by one online it's wiped out the Ministry of Post and Telecommunications, right? And for the most part, people block in states like China, but certainly in the West. And the central bank is now being undermined by Bitcoin and alternative currencies, just the way corporations have been undermined by online activity. Violence, well, I mentioned Anonymous and ISIS and Al-Qaeda and various other non-state actors that use these technologies very ably. I guess the question is, what's the state for? Many people in the Valley would just like it to get out of the way, these arch-libertarians.
Right.
What does the state do inside this kind of a system where it's being dismantled?
Right. I mean, so like I said, the mandate of the state is different than the mandate of the corporations, and it has to provide these collective social goods. And we've also built certain values into the state, norms into the state of accountability and the rule of law and social justice, and these things that we've embedded in our system of democracy or in our state system. So the real question for me is, what do those core values look like in a world that, like you point out, is less strictly controlled by the mechanisms of the state? But in each of those examples, there's different phenomena going on, and this is why I think it's important to keep sort of picking apart each of these. So in the control of information, if it used to be that post offices did that, what are the new control points in the information architecture now? And in some cases, those are very state-driven, right? We know this architecture is built by companies and allowed by states in certain places and controlled by states in certain ways, and often very meaningful ways in countries like China and Russia, right? So that architecture is a highly political system that is connected to states in interesting ways. So each one of these, in the violence space, I mean, I think that there's real cases where the state has become very adept at leveraging predictive models and automated systems to deploy violence in a new way that we need to understand better. In the financial system, yes, we used to have a huge amount of state power came from controlling currency, certainly. But what does it mean now when, like you say, those levers of control are being degraded, even on the periphery, by new cryptocurrency technologies? And you see this really interesting phenomena happening in the cryptocurrency community, I think, which you would know and people here would know better than me, but from what I see is you see this real tension between this techno-libertarian, like you say, origins and this anti-state origins of these technologies. I mean, the core Bitcoin model really was a liberation technology, right?
Yeah.
It was to leverage control away from the state. So you have this crypto-anarchist community that's supporting Bitcoin. But then you also have Silicon Valley saying, really, this should be the new currency of the internet, right? This should be the new PayPal. This should just be the way in which goods and services are shared online. And so there's this real tension, I think, between these crypto-anarchists who want to take down the system and Silicon Valley that sees this as a financial architecture of the internet. And
Many of the
where
early
the government
anarchists-
falls in that, I don't know.
Many of the early libertarians are now learning certain profitable virtues to talking to the SEC and making this kind of slide in a co-opted way.
Absolutely, which is the whole interesting point, is the intersection of Silicon Valley and the state, and that's something we talk about, and you know far more about than I do. But they're getting into more and more Silicon Valley's moving into federally regulated spaces, whether it be the auto sector or whatever, right? Or
Sure.
the financial sector.
Oh, there's nothing they don't want to put software in out here. Trust me.
Absolutely.
But international relations at its heart dwells in history. You look for parallels. You have how rules got established as the outcome of wars or social movements in the past. The Valley loves to sort of think of itself as being continually made fresh, and this idea of disruption, just breaking the old rules don't matter anymore. Are there actually historical parallels, though, that we can draw on to learn how this might play out? Have you seen things like this happen before in history?
I mean, there's a long history of information technologies changing the way people relate with each other, the way people the senses of identity and representation, their relationships to the state. There's no question about that. But I do think we're exiting a period where of information, in the information technology world, an industrial period of information scarcity, where information could be controlled. Controlled by states, controlled by media companies, controlled by corporations, and the game was who can broadcast information and who can consume information.
Right.
It was a broadcast relationship, and that's the industrial model of information sharing. That to me is changing, right? We've moved away from that broadcast model to a model where more people can participate in a media ecosystem, more people can arguably have voice. And that is a slightly different change to me than that trajectory that's evolved through that industrial model.
Right.
From
Google
text to radio to
Google
video.
kind of scrapes the whole internet in real time and tells you, has a knowledge of what's out there. And as much as it's offering you stuff, in some ways it's just pushing away all the stuff that isn't relevant to you. It's like a filter in in a world of excess.
Absolutely.
Facebook has you connected to however many friends you have. It then offers the ones it thinks matter most to you at that time. And you've got this very strange kind of business of pushing back information that never existed before.
Absolutely, and we need that because
We'd be
we're
overwhelmed
drowning in
otherwise.
this
Yeah.
space, right? But the ways in which, one interesting question around this is, how are they filtering this information, right? It used to be when a newspaper would tell us about the world, there was a degree of transparency of who those people were and what their biases were and how they were learning about what they were telling us and who they were. That's
It
just
was
not
a fairly set narrative.
It was,
about
absolutely.
international relations and major actors and what
Right.
crime was. All those things are sort of being redefined
and
right
hugely
now.
problematic, right? Because we
Yeah.
know those were laden with all sorts of biases and
No question.
subjectivities and all these things, right? The challenge with filtering online, and particularly with Google and Facebook, is we know this filtering is happening through algorithms that we don't have access to and that are constantly evolving over time. They're growing and they're incredibly complex, and they're creating this world of information. They're deciding what we see in a way we don't understand. And there's a challenge of accountability there.
In terms of the new powers challenging the states, which ones did you look at that you found particularly interesting, and what were some of the habits they showed off?
I mean, I think the cryptocurrency one's fascinating because there's money in it. There's just a huge amount of evolution in what's in both the technologies, but also the markets that they're going to connect into. I think there's fascinating things happening.
You spend
in
a
that
lot of
space.
time on Anonymous as well.
Yeah, I think Anonymous is interesting. And it's interesting because, I mean,
Let me just probably explain for the audience just who Anonymous is, if Anonymous can be said to be
right. I mean,
anybody.
isn't really anybody, right? It's anybody who says they're a participant in this network called Anonymous can be a member of Anonymous,
And
but
its mission is?
there isn't really a mission. The mission, I mean, you might say there's a mission of radical transparency. You might say it's overthrowing established powers. You might say it's just making fun of people,
Yeah.
right? It's different depending on different subsets. Which
The
makes
mission
it
is to throw a wrench in the gears. At times it doesn't like stuff by
absolutely
overwhelming a government website, by revealing personal information about people it deems bad actors, by what else?
Yeah. So there's this wonderful case where the U.S. government was getting increasingly flummoxed by Anonymous and by what they do about this, right? So they set up this working group which had members of the British intelligence agencies, the USA intelligence agencies, and a few other countries to figure out what they were going to do to stop Anonymous. So they had their first call to figure this out.
Oh, yeah.
And they're talking about, in the preamble to this call, they're like, we can't believe we're on this call to talk about these like kids in their basement, and we can't believe that we're being forced to have this conversation. And 2 days later, the whole transcript, or the whole recording of the conversation was released online, because Anonymous had hacked into this. And
They were sitting in the back of
they're
the
sitting
room.
in the background listening to this whole thing, listening to be made fun of, right? And there's all sorts of nuances to that anecdote, but it is interesting that these types of capabilities, particularly in that stage where we didn't really understand what they were, I think really rattled governments. Now, Anonymous there's nothing sort of there's nothing. They don't have a monopoly over the use of these technologies. So there's another group called Telecomics, which is also a network of largely anonymous, decentralized, collaborative hackers whose motto is, where anonymous breaks things, we build things. And when throughout the Arab Spring, they called themselves the tech support for the Arab Spring. So when Assad was cracking down on or surveilling Syrian citizens, they would go in and teach people how to be more secure online and use anonymizing tools, and right. So there's these networks of individuals that I think provide new layers in these international contexts that we're not used to seeing, and understanding their role in those is important, I think.
Now, you look mostly at the relationship between Britain, Canada, the U.S., and these groups. But China and Russia are interesting to think about because they, in some cases, co-opt non-state actors as part of their power system, don't they?
Absolutely. I mean, co-opt in terms of both seek to control, but also allow to participate. Right. So in China, there's a very active social web, but it's enabled by the state, and it's very much an escape valve almost for.
Or for that matter, sometimes, if I were to get a hack on a U.S. corporation seeking valuable information, and it came from a university in China that was affiliated with the military, would that be a state act? Would that be a criminal act? Would that be some guy out for laughs? All of the above, right?
Yeah, I mean, probably, yeah.
So it gets very hard to know what the rules are, to know who to go up against, right?
Absolutely, and I mean, it's.
You talk to these. I'm sure you talk to people in various governments.
Yeah.
What are they going to do?
Well, this relationship between corporations and states and individual actors is also challenging here too.
It's played
right?
out here too.
I mean, look at the surveillance architecture companies or the device companies that are based in the U.S. and sold to both democratic and autocratic countries, right? Like that's a new challenge that we have to engage with. There's also, I think, a real question of what happens when the interests of corporations with power and agency online conflict with the interest of their host states. So what happens if Google gets attacked by a foreign government and the U.S. government doesn't respond?
What happens?
Surely we think they're going to. At some point, they're going to start responding themselves, right? So there is this space of.
What happens when they send all their taxes through a small office in Ireland and don't pay them? we
Right.
see this already in some ways, right?
Absolutely, but I think there are some things that are going to start to emerge where these corporations. I think they're already doing this to a certain degree through their cyber defenses, and but there are going to be cases where we get distinct acts of violence perpetrated by corporations in the cyberspace.
There is
disjointed from
there
their
is
host
actually a
states.
carrier in Colorado that has gone on to identify individuals and name them, which is something other corporations were not willing to do.
Naming individuals that are
Hackers,
attacking them.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, like
right.
say this
Right.
guy,
Right.
go get him.
Wow.
You know, and being very public about it.
Yeah.
And yeah, you could say a little digital vigilanteism in a way,
Yeah.
but the rules have changed,
It's a bit of-
or
yeah.
we don't know what the rules are, which is a better way to put it.
The rules have changed in the sense that the things that enable individuals and groups have those powers are different. We haven't adapted our current infrastructure for it, but I'm skeptical that we're going to be able to. The tendency we consistently see, particularly in the internet governance space, is how are states going to get together to control these actors that we don't like the behavior of in this digital space. And maybe those levers of control that used to exist just don't translate to this space. And what does that mean for governments? It's a real problem.
Well, you know, the Catholic Church was a dominant power in Europe when the printing press came around. And they had their first book burning in 1510. 6 years later, Martin Luther was a best-selling author, and they had to deal with the Reformation.
Right.
Governments are very good, as a rule, with rearward-looking activity for both good and evil.
Yeah.
I mean, or for both good and bad, as it were. You know, they tend to, as they say, they tend to fight the last war, right? they tend to police along what they've known before.
Yeah.
So when something shows up like this, they have a really hard time understanding it. I think corporations tend to respond faster
Yeah.
because they have less of a legacy business they have to deal with.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, the other thing that the challenge states face in trying to seek control in this ecosystem is that many of the same technologies that empower what states would consider negative actors also empower what we would all think are goods in the digital space. So the ability to protect one's data and enter into financial transactions online is dependent on encryption. The ability for us to organize and speak to each other is based on these diffuse networks that we have open access to. Right? There's some good, but those very same technologies are what enable ISIL to post videos to Twitter without them being taken down quickly, or allow Silk Road to operate relatively unscathed for a period of time in an encrypted
Sending heroin
environment.
to a middle schooler if you so want.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So if the state says it's our responsibility in providing collective security for our citizens to crack down on Silk Road, and the things they have to do to crack down on Silk Road, like break encryption, could actually break the architecture of the internet. That's a real problem for governments. And that's why I think we've seen this huge pushback from Silicon Valley against this effort to break encryption by the US government. And that was almost the crisis point where they were like, okay, this is where it stops, right? Like this will actually break everything that's underlying the architecture we've built.
What in reporting all this has scared or troubled you the most? And what has made you the most optimistic? Because reading the book, you seem like something of an optimist about the outcome.
It is. It shifts over time, I think, and I've gotten more and more pessimistic throughout it. I mean,
Oh.
it started out as trying to map how actors were doing interesting things in ways that perhaps they couldn't before. And to me, that was a very hopeful process, right? There's a lot of people doing interesting things that they couldn't do before through
Yay
using technology.
liberation, yay flow of information.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Talking to each other, organizing, all these things that are positive and are real. Like I do think there's this dismissiveness that this is all just trite social media is to me not true, right? Like there's some real empowering implications of these technologies. The thing that's changed for me though is actually when the Snowden revelations came out, and I think we really saw through that the degree to which the state was shaken by the empowerment of these technologies, whether it be through the way Al-Qaeda and then ISIS was using them, whether it be through the way the black markets were using them, right? And actually, in a way that ended up supporting the thesis, which is people are empowered in ways that arguably take power away from established institutions and actors, right? Like, I think that supports that thesis. But until those revelations, I don't think we had a good sense of the degree to which Western states in particular were going to react and were willing to push back. And I think they really did think that what we're seeing play out now is that the way to control this ecosystem or this digital space is to, as they say, know it all, process it all, predict it all, right?
Control everything.
Control everything, right? And looking at this digital space as if it were a battlefield, that the more we know, the more information we collect, the better our outcomes will be. The more we'll be able to strategically act in that space. And I'm just not sure that translates in a world of information abundance.
That's
and
a bit of that
scaling
fighting the last
information.
war thing, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
How do we control this battlefield of cyberspace?
The towers get hit, and in
Right.
Washington, the first meeting is about where to send the aircraft carrier.
Absolutely.
And they don't realize they have a non-state actor
Yeah.
that may be staying in Afghanistan, but that is almost an ancillary moment in terms of the overall conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. But the place they end up going, right? So we know through the Snowden revelations that they've collected all of this data, and what do you do with this massive amount of data and these huge flows of information? And we know where that's going, which is more and more automation, more and more predictive behavior, predictive policing, automated violence, mass surveillance with algorithm-driven behavior behind it, right? So we know that you can't process this information.
This is the pessimistic part you got to eventually, right?
Absolutely, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And
So are we in a state where we've never had more personal empowerment thanks to access to all this information? Or are we in a state where we've never been subject to more control and manipulation because of this technology?
I I mean, so it's both, but it largely depends on who one is and what one wants to do, right? So if I just want to share information with my colleagues and friends and disseminate my information, I'm more empowered than ever. If I want to organize a political protest, I could be potentially less secure than I was, or less capable than I was now, because of how we know we're being watched and how we know the long-term implications of that are. I mean, one of the things I've been working on is what it means for journalists to exist in this state, in a state of the type of surveillance systems we know. And what journalists are starting to say is, look, we actually can't protect our sources anymore because we know that this data is being stored and it can be reverse engineered to identify sources.
An increasing number of biographies on Twitter will have your public encryption key listed along with your biography, which is
a sign that
as close as you can come to a secure communication system.
Right. So in that sense, both in the journalism space and in the civil disobedience space, I think that the changes of behavior are on the margins and are on people who are high likelihood of being surveyed and targeted. And if behavior starts changing on those margins, it could have real implications.
So the state is a controlling agent, but the state also has a very important function, and we could argue about how successful it is at this, but it has final responsibility for some of the weakest members.
Yes.
The poor, the old, the young, in terms of education, in terms of health care, you can argue how well or poorly it does it, but that is a role we have given the state. And I don't see any non-state actors who are even interested in helping the weakest of us all. Is that a long-term problem for how we treat the infirm, the unable? If the state is robbed of resources, can they still carry out those functions?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the dilemma to me. I mean, so there's all sorts of ways that plays out. I mean, the more and more that Silicon Valley has a pretense of replacing certain delivery of social goods to a certain group of people and not guaranteeing it to everybody, which state was what the primary mandate of states is, at least creating that collective bottom, then that's a real problem. I think it also challenges how people are represented in our political systems. So who has agency in a political system and who needs the state and who doesn't. And that's a real challenge. And then there's a real question about what alternative forms of representation and politics are emerging in the space to counter that. And I do think there's some interesting examples of the ways in which people are organizing, the ways people are making decisions in this space that probably do have implications for how the state needs to adapt to this
It's
world.
interesting. The first question on my list is, do you see technologies being able to disrupt the government and being able to provide social goods without the need of the state? A friend of mine's had a terrible tragedy where his daughter was rather severely injured and will need a lot of rehabilitation. I'm contributing on GoFundMe because the state will not pay for that. Is that an example of that kind of thing?
I mean, it is, but these examples are always limited, right? They're
Yeah.
always to certain groups and certain people, and usually these people are who are already connected to a certain
Right. I have the
ecosystem.
wherewithal to connect to other people. He did too.
You're the technology reporter for the New York Times, right? Like
This is
you
true.
are deeply connected to this world in a way
Right.
that most people aren't, and I think that discrepancy is a real challenge. Absolutely. Now you see it with the Uber debate right now. You see it with the Airbnb debate, right? That generally these things might be more efficient, but what gets lost?
Oh, yeah.
Right? When we remove the system of accountability that we've built on top of these exchange of services.
What does make you hopeful in all this? What have you seen that you thought was just great? Oh, come on, something.
I think the ability of people to speak to each other and to organize with each other is a remarkably powerful thing.
I've seen amazing hacks inside the system, but you go first.
Yeah, I mean, there's that, and there's also just that, and not to step on media toes, but the wresting of the pulling away of control over what we know and how we learn and how we communicate from a limited group of people, to me, is an incredibly hopeful thing. It's messy, and there's all sorts of problems with how we find information and what we do with it. And
A lot of
what
lists
we all
with cats in them, but
a
also
lot
some
of that,
really
but
valuable
also
information.
some really exciting. And so this world of media innovation right now, to me, is thrilling, and it's really exciting space. I think there's really fascinating things happening in new ways, new forms of representational democracy. What does democracy look like in a place where people can actively participate in new ways? I think ultimately the Arab Spring, despite how it's played out, was an incredibly hopeful series of events that embodied a lot of what we're talking about. Now, clearly the state fought back in ways that are immensely brutal and horrific. But the ability for people to push back against what were decades-long autocracies is hopeful.
Oh, there are great examples of hacks, particularly in places that don't get seen very well by conventional media. I know a guy out of South Africa who hacked the signaling part of cell towers, how you hand off a phone from one tower to another, and parked in it prenatal health information for women all across many states in Africa. So on the cheapest phone imaginable, they could find out stuff they could do to stay healthy for their baby ahead of time. And this has then been picked up by people doing election stuff in these countries and kind of surfacing who's taking money from who.
Yeah.
Likewise, in Indonesia, Suharto fell because activists collected information about what his family owned on various islands. It's a very diffuse place, 12,000 islands, and posted it in one place online. And the people went in the streets when they saw that the graft wasn't just local, it was collective. And that led to this collective action.
Yeah.
But it tends to be good politically for good and ill on a kind of one-shot basis.
Yeah, that's it, right? And
You know,
so
they
how
like-
does this sustain over time? It's
Yeah,
a
I
real
mean, has there
question.
been an online group that came up with a program and a definition of itself over a long period that people could identify with the way they once identified with being Canadian, being American?
Yeah, yeah. No is the answer yet, but I think it's pretty early days in this. There's a lot of experimentation happening. I mean, the Pirate Party is actually a super interesting case of people trying to institutionalize some of these values inside an established democratic system.
Say more.
Well, they have this concept of fluid democracy, where instead of having static representation of either a group of people in a proportional representation model where you represent a subsection of society, or a region, or you represent a riding, they're saying, well, maybe representation should evolve constantly based on the governance questions at play. So say there's a topic of healthcare reform. Shouldn't the people representing us actually be the people who know something about this topic? So people within this online system will emerge as leaders on a particular topic, be given agency by the political party, act that out, and then step back as other issues emerge. So, like, who knows if it's going to work? Pirate Party is actually doing remarkably well in a few countries, but they're thinking through this, right? Like, what does it mean to take the values of a collaborative online space, decentralized online environment, and bring it into this very structured system of an established state? And it's messy, and it's lots of trial and error, but there's some interesting experiments happening.
Now, the nation state, which has been dominant since like 1650, something like that. Even in saying that, I say it didn't exist before. There were other ways people organized power.
Yes.
What makes you confident it lasts?
I mean, I don't think states are going away. I think their spheres of influence and their ability to control are changing.
Corporations like them. In general, most citizens like having them around because you know
Yep.
what the rules are.
Yep.
But somebody asks, we have global currency, global cultures, global education. Is there a chance we see the global power of states being reduced and a kind of internet common power emerging?
Well, up until that final, the internet common power, I agree with that.
That
right?
was
Like,
a squishy
it's-
term. I didn't know where to go with that.
No,
either.
but because I think the new borders we're seeing are largely about controlling this information system. So where servers are based, where transatlantic wires cross in and out of countries and are controlled by governments. So there's a very physical infrastructure to this digital space that is in some ways controlled by governments still. So you see this when there was after the Snowden revelations, that the president of Brazil basically said, okay, well, we're not going to if this is what you're doing to the information that flows through the U.S., we're just not going to physically move data through the U.S. We're going to build our own transatlantic cable system that connects the BRICS, right? And we'll have an agreement that we won't do the types of things you're doing on the system, right? So that's a very political move. It's a very statist move. It's very physical. There's a physicality to these cables, and it's drawing new borders, right? If that happens, if Russia and China each build their own internets, that creates new spheres of power and influence, and so this is playing out in this information space, but in ways that don't look like our physical borders necessarily.
Ultimately, wildly free information, authoritarian information, those kind of designations could create new domains. Yes. It's interesting you say that, because I teach a course at Berkeley about information technology and politics. And my final question in class is, what would you die for? You're not allowed to say family, because people die for near connections, but what abstraction would you die for? Because
that's a tough question.
It is a tough one.
You're a tough teacher.
It doesn't count on the test.
That should be the first question of the year.
Because the reason is, it's a good way to identify what you live for. It has a lot to do with identity. And people used to say the flag or my country. I never get that, but of course I'm at Berkeley, so we'll discount. But, I think it is a more common feeling because...
what do they say?
I was going there.
Okay.
But you do, people don't relate to the state the way they used to. They don't get drafted. They tend to travel a lot. The richest people will live anywhere and everywhere, and kind of don't care what passport they're carrying the way they used to. And they communicate in English and see each other at the TED Talk, right? But the one thing that I tend to get every year in the last 3 or 4 years is the flow of information. Freedom of information. I would die for the internet. I would die for the ability to connect on this level and see that this goes on, so that if there ever is a hack to our system of information by another power, it's going to be the greatest possible affront to some of our greatest elites, and is a real counter to how information may be seen in other countries.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating, right? And it's kind of chilling in a way, because we know that break in the way people know the internet and that free flow of information isn't going to be a singular event that makes them rebel against it. We know that it's a slow evolution of how this space is controlled, who has power within it, and that if people didn't change behavior, knowing now what we know about how this space is, how data is collected, how it's used, then what's going to create that crisis point that shifts behavior? And I'm not sure I see it.
A firebrand leader, typically, who says what's in the back of people's minds. A great YouTube video in this case, right? Maybe. We shall see. Question from the audience. Do you know or expect that government operatives may begin initiating social or political movements via anonymous digital media to meet their desires in a covert way? Is there this is what we call astroturfing in the corporate world, where it looks like a grassroots movement saying, Tide gets my clothes cleaner. No offense to the good people of Tide. But, it looks like a grassroots movement, but it's being engineered.
Right. I mean,
do you see
absolutely
nations doing this as well?
Of course, we see it all the time, right? And we see it. The one space where I talk about a lot in this conversation is a conversation about digital diplomacy and the way foreign ministries in particular have tried to engage in this digital space. And there's a great example of the USAID turned out in collaboration with the CIA, building a fake version of Twitter based on text messaging in Cuba. And it was a full front company based in Honduras that went in, and had this startup idea that they were going to help people exchange information inside Cuba, and it got up to 40 or 50,000 users or something in Havana. And then it got outed that this was actually a covert operation to foster dissent inside Cuba. So these things happen all the time, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But they backfire pretty horribly because governments are pretty bad at doing this kind of thing ultimately,
Right.
So like what happened there? The USAID gets outed as this CIA collaboration entity, which there's the long history of.
Right.
But another round of that conversation, the USAID had to leave Cuba. So it ends up harming
And of
certain
course-
technology companies that are also in this space, and so these things backfire. And
It,
governments aren't
it
very good at
invites one of the worst weapons on the internet, ridicule.
absolutely. So
Right.
remember when that story came out, it was a month of mockery.
Nobody wants
around-
to be seen as a doofus, right?
Right.
To what extent have you come across unintended positive consequences from the non-state actors on state actors through public diplomacy? Greater transparency, greater accountability. What has surprised you the most?
Well,
Give me a good story here.
I'm not sure those are unintended consequences. I think often these are intended consequences. That there's there's actually a fair amount of deliberation in a lot of these groups that are using these technologies. Right? They're actually able to do things. That the telecomics example is remarkable. The guy who founded this thing, Peter Fine, just look him up and look at some of the way he talks about this. I mean, this guy is an ideologue, and he's this guy who said, look, like, we're going to go help people who are being killed because they aren't able to access the internet and can speak out to the world in Syria and Egypt at the time. We're going to bring Tahrir Square back online when the internet went off, right? Like this is real sort of ideology and zeal behind it, and he did it, right? Like he did for a moment. That was a really powerful act, and so I do think there's a lot of
What happened in Egypt that afterward?
after.
Why did it go sideways?
Well, I mean, there was no alternative. The military stepped back and watched it all happen and watched the state collapse and then stepped in. I mean,
Yeah,
pretty.
they were not looking forward to the outcome. Yeah.
No, well, the military was looking at absolutely.
Yeah, and decided to reimpose control.
Yeah.
Are governments nervous about these new channels of power? Are particular governments more nervous? Are particular governments more chill, as it were?
I mean, my whole thesis is an argument that definitely that governments are concerned, and they're more concerned than we thought they were. And
Right.
That's what's revealed in what we now know about the extent to which they're willing to seek to control and crack down on this space.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're fundamentally concerned, and they're concerned for good and bad reasons, right? they're concerned because what they perceive as nefarious actors, whether they be terrorist organizations or black markets or criminal organizations, are able to do things that they can't stop in this space. So that's a very legitimate concern. If you're a government and your primary mandate is to protect a collective group of people, and you can't do it because you can't stop a certain type of actor, that's a totally legitimate concern.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they're also concerned because they know, like you pointed out, that their mandate is to provide goods and services to everybody, not just to a few, and that mandate is threatened and it's potentially made more difficult when they don't adapt to this world, and they're being challenged by actors who claim to be able to do it more efficiently and sometimes very much do. So the second piece. And the third piece is in a very real way, hierarchical organizations, whether they be departments or governments or companies or media companies or international organizations, have a built-in self-preservation mechanism where they have a mandate, but they also are built to exist and to be robust and to last over time.
Mm-hmm.
And so they are fighting off some of these new ideas because it doesn't fit within the way they're structured and the way they're organized. And so there's an identity crisis there and an existential crisis to a certain degree at times that really challenges them.
Now, in international affairs, treaties matter a great deal. We used to discuss throw weights with the Russians over atomic weaponry, who could have what, and we'd check each other.
Yeah.
Or we have treaties, or we have supposedly ideas about what people can and can't do inside their own state. Although as things become visible, we start to act on them. A question from the audience is, the U.S. talks about potential sanctions against China while also engaging in cyber espionage abroad. What good are cyber rules when those who write them don't adhere to them? Hey, what is a U.S. to do when it both wants to dictate, it sees threats being undertaken by other large states, it acts like them as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a central dilemma of this emerging governance conversation, is that you have a bunch of states trying to get together to talk about how they're going to control behavior in a space in which they're all doing the same things to each other that they're
Right.
trying to stop other people from doing, right? I mean, there's a real sort of almost hypocrisy at the center of that, and that's a real challenge. I think
And
that
yet, China, when Xi Jinping was here, they did sign a cyber treaty or make step towards it, right? So do we see some progress here?
Yeah, and that there could be sort of commercial interest driving that. You see that popping back up in the TPP again, right? Where we have certain copyright protections that states all value that are being embedded in these
The
agreements.
Trans-Pacific Partnership. this
Yeah, so you see sort of
treaty that's
copyright
being written
protections
out
that are
now.
being embedded in this to a degree that that aren't yet embedded in national regulations and national law, and that's part of them trying to, I think, control their interests in this space. But what happened? I mean, when the Snowden revelations data came out, you heard a lot about before that, if you back up a little bit, it was always we're all spying on each other, of course, but China's different because it's industrial espionage, not just security espionage. It's not just normal statecraft. This is actually espionage on behalf of an industry that is totally connected with the Chinese state. But now what do we know? Of course we know that Western governments are doing this as well. We're using these technologies and this surveillance capability to pass information on to companies in our countries, right? So at some point, if everybody's doing this, it's incredibly hard for states to have legitimacy in seeking to control it. I don't know the way out of that. I really don't.
We have to invent new language and new standards. We just don't know what those are going to be yet, right?
New language, new standards, and new ways of bringing the values, like I said, and the norms that we placed in governments and in states, and that we think are important, moving those into a different system.
Yeah.
And what does accountability and the rule of law and justice, social justice, look like in a place, in an international, fluid, digital space? I don't think and who needs to be around the table to be a part of that conversation, other than just states?
I
think we're at the very beginning of that.
Yeah, in your book you mentioned that the nation state arises with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. The states get established. That came after wars of the Reformation that lasted the better part of a century and killed off about a third of Germany.
Right.
That's a bad example. The good example is we never really had a second nuclear conflict after the end of World War II. And that's a pretty good, knock wood, pretty good run so far.
Yeah.
What helps and what hurts in terms of avoiding a cataclysm?
I mean, and the question there is, do the principles that stopped that next nuclear act, do those translate into this space?
Well,
And I don't know they do. I'm not sure they do.
fear helped a lot. Like a deep understanding of just how destructive it might be. Sort of
Fear,
a
but
transparency
Fear
about it.
amongst between states,
Right.
right? States that had control over that.
Good
the
point. ISIS
deployment
is
of
not
the
afraid.
technology.
Yeah.
Well, probably not. And now, I mean, we haven't done a particularly good job at stopping the proliferation of these weapons, right? We've stopped probably the use up until now, but a lot of people have this technology.
True.
So
So another question from the audience. Governments are having trouble keeping up with digital technology, such as fighting ISIS on social media. What have you seen in which they are adapting or evolving in useful ways?
ways in which governments have adapted.
Yeah.
I mean, despite pointing out the Twitter example in Cuba, which isn't a particularly good one, I think the willingness of foreign ministries to experiment in this place is interesting. The Canadian government, for example, during the Iranian election, very controversially closed their embassy, their physical embassy, and instead created a secure digital space where Iranian citizens could debate the election.
Mm-hmm.
And they sort of encrypted this space where it was an open and free place.
Mm-hmm.
There was something like 4 million participants in this in the lead up to the election, this big space of public dialogue. And it was really controversial and didn't work and backfired in some ways. But this willingness to experiment, I think, is where there's interesting happens in the governance space. But you often see them getting into trouble. I mean, you look at all the attempt of healthcare systems to digitize, right? Like a
Right.
clear thing that should be happening, but almost always ends up in some sort of challenge, right? So,
Well, I think some of the issues there had to do with the fact that they hired the guys they always had hired in the past who didn't understand cyber very well. And once they brought in some guys who had
Right.
worked online, they fixed the healthcare website fairly quickly.
right.
If you look at the evolution of the military budget
Mm.
in the U.S., it's quite interesting that there isn't as much interest in building aircraft carriers now as there is in giving money to intelligence agencies, smaller strike teams, and drones.
Yeah.
And if you sort of think of the corollary in information, that's a lot of small touch points and then a big kind of information cloud computing system. It's almost the equivalent of mobile phones connecting back into big cloud computing systems.
Yes.
And so that warfare has this intelligence gathering and then projecting violence in the smallest way possible. Now, drones haven't worked out so great lately, but it's interesting that they've kind of imitated the existing technology to project power in new ways.
Definitely.
They are trying to evolve, it seems like.
I mean, they're trying to evolve, but the second you build a system of warfare on top of this data system, it takes a fair amount of the human engagement out of the process.
Yes.
And increasingly, we're getting to a space where more and more of these decisions, whether they be targeting decisions or selection decisions of people to kill or arrest, are being automated. And
A really interesting-
And that's to me, and what does it mean to hold that to account, right? To that process to account as citizens.
Yeah.
What does it mean for us to hold our governments to account when we know that people are being targeted via algorithms that we don't understand and that are constantly evolving and that are based on real-time big data flows?
It's very interesting
We
how
don't know
quickly,
the answer to that. Yeah.
the mistakes and the outcomes of state violence are now publicized for all to see. Most recently, this drone strike on a MSF hospital in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Not a
was
drone
made
strike,
vis-
actually. I think that was an actual.
That was a military strike. It was a
Yeah,
military
yeah.
strike called an, excuse me.
Yeah.
But a drone strike that hits a leader's home, doesn't get him, but gets his children,
Right.
is publicized immediately. Can you imagine if World War I had been so visible, World War II rather, had been so visible online?
Right.
Like we never would have gotten past Normandy. You know, those kind of messes would have been made visible for everybody. And in a way that's kind of hopeful because we're valuing human life much more than we used to.
Yeah.
There's a really positive message in that. Other people get killed in collateral damage by high altitude bombing. We just sort of went on. Now when you can see them all, we really think about it more carefully.
Yeah, I mean,
So it's messy, but there may be a deeper positive in that as well.
possibly. I mean, I think there's sometimes these are case specific too. I mean, that there is an outcry over certain of those incidents, but most of the carnage in Syria has also been live streamed and reported and pretty widely viewed by the world, and yet didn't
Right.
lead to any sort of
There has-
engagement.
yeah.
So at some point, and this is a question of journalism, right? If people know, will they act, and will it change government behaviors if citizens know about what's happening? And that we know that is almost never the case.
What state
right?
actor wants to get involved there?
Sure,
And
right. I mean, that's
how much can they control the outcome,
Right,
which is
there's
what
a-
they usually want to do in warfare.
right. As always, and the other question with where violence is going, where warfare is going, is the ways in which these technologies, like they always do, feed back into domestic processes and domestic governance.
Yes, you were
So-
mentioning some high altitude
Right, so
observation
there's-
devices.
So there are these Lockheed Martin blimps were deployed over Syria, which they called them pervasive surveillance systems, where they could take real-time video at incredibly high resolution over a city, and they just float them over a city. And they build all sorts of predictive models on top of this data to look for irregular movements, to track people over time, over days and weeks, and their movements around the city. And then action was based on, they deploy action based on this algorithmic analysis. And these blimps have been, they've been moving to the Mexican-U.S. border. And on 25 kilometers on either side of the Mexican border, there's I think there's no, you probably know this, but there's no, the search and seizure laws are loosened on 25 miles on each side of the border. And so they floated these blimps as trials over cities and tracked people's movement and tried to track irregular activity. So these things are often...
Who needs a wall, right?
Right, who needs a wall? And a lot of these technologies that are developed in conflict end up moving into these these legal gray areas in our countries, which are often borders.
We've seen that in domestic policing too, with the rise of SWAT teams and the rise of what had been military stuff in Iraq coming back home, so that small police forces have Humvees that are heavily armored. And
right. And that's in a very physical sense. I mean, we're also seeing all sorts of surveillance technologies
I was going to go there.
in war zones being given to local policing agencies, predictive policing models that try and predict where violence is going to happen and deploy resources based on that. I mean, all of this is being developed in conflict contexts in which we loosen and relax these norms of accountability and legal structures, and now we're seeing them being brought back into domestic contexts.
Yes, and the same.
And there's some. I think we need to think about that.
The same consumer technologies can be militarized or turned into policing agents. I was looking at a demonstration about a big data for policing company, and the mock-up was a bomb scare, as it happened in Berkeley. And they threw up some maps, and they threw up all the nearby exits on all the buses and subways. And I was able to check it out, and it was quite accurate, actually, for that area. I knew that part of town. And then they said, and here are all the garbage cans, all the municipal garbage cans. And there is a database of 300,000 garbage cans in the state of California that is known and can be deployed. Well, if somebody's got a bomb, you want to know all the garbage cans because maybe they throw it in there, right? But it's kind of creepy too, right? It's just the ability to connect to the larger world and control it has never been so vast.
Absolutely.
What's this going to look like in 5 or 10 years?
I mean, you were just saying before that Silicon Valley companies don't think beyond 18 months.
Right.
It's a constant rolling 18-month analysis. So
yeah, they just hit the signal. They don't know what they're building for the most part.
So I don't know. I mean, I think automation and the artificial intelligence around that is going to be a huge problem that we have to face. Like we were saying, I think there's a lot of interesting questions around computational power and where that goes, and whether people achieve quantum computing and whether that becomes a reality. And that has a real potential to change power balances in an international system. I think the virtual worlds we're building are increasingly interesting as they interconnect with the state. How do we bring the values of the state into a virtual environment?
What do you find so compelling about a virtual environment or a virtual world?
I think that the very thing that makes them arguably attractive, or that people will use them, is that they are difficult to control, and that people can be things they don't want, that they wouldn't otherwise be in a physical world, and have relationships they couldn't otherwise have. And that's a challenge when you're trying to build society. Well, a society and regulate a society and provide services within a society. So and we don't know where that's going to go, right? But we can look at where certain technologies companies project that's going to go, right? Like if you listen to Facebook's vision of why they bought Oculus and what world, the Facebook world they imagine building. There's real questions, I think, of how we're going to engage with each other in that space.
Oh, yes, and they've also purchased artificial intelligence talent and software so that they say probably a few decades out, there is this agent that just travels through life and knows what you need to see next. Who's making those choices about what I see next? And what role does the state have in what I see next, what I consume in terms of my concept of civics and freedom? They controlled textbooks before, but this.
Absolutely.
My goodness.
Yeah.
It's really a whole other level.
And the international dimension of that is the expansion of some of these companies into controlling the digital experiences of people in other countries too. Like you see this whole Internet Org debate in India playing out, that in a very real way, that was about controlling what people see in a digital space in another country.
Mhm.
There's real international implications to that, I think.
Well, I'm going to close with an observation from that great technologist and international relations thinker Mahatma Gandhi. People want the future so perfect that they won't have to be good. And I guess your message is technology's never going to make us so perfect that we don't have to still be good and think about who we are and what we're doing and what kind of world we want to build.
Absolutely.
Right.
That's a nice way to end it.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Great.